Hello there, Totemites, and welcome to our channel. Today we're talking about the art of comic book investing. Now, this is a subject that seemingly everybody has the answer to. A quick search on Google will show you that many people are asking this question, and many people are finding answers, albeit maybe the wrong ones. Now, I'm not going to claim to have all the answers, but I will try and give you a more detailed analysis of why comic book investing is or isn't a good idea right now. As someone who has collected all sorts of comic books over the past year and a half and spent more than I'd like to admit on comic books, I think that I have a pretty good idea of where the comic book industry is headed and where it's been. Now, I thought it'd be a good idea for us first to take The Walking Dead #1 as sort of a starting point for discussion on comic book investment. The Walking Dead #1, which was written by Robert Kirkman and penned by Charlie Adlard, is one of the more interesting comic books in this realm because it is a modern comic book that is published after 1980, and it has gone up significantly in value. Now, yeah, much of that's because of the TV show, but we also have to look at some of the other facets of this comic book. Now, The Walking Dead #1 actually cost about $100 just a few months after its release. It had a low print run, and it had originally cost $2.95. Now, this was long before anyone ever thought about turning The Walking Dead into a TV show. We're here in 2016 after years and years of people saying this comic book would stop going up in value, and it has proven us wrong time and time again. This 2003 published comic book is now $2,000 for just a decent copy, and I think that that is something exceptional for us to look at in terms of comic book investment. Now, the naysayers will tell you that this comic book is topped out at around $2,000 for a high-grade copy, but I think that's really short-sighted, to be quite honest with you. The comic book is at a point right now where comic books are being sold faster than ever. We're at the top of a bull market, the recession is probably on its way next year, and we're looking at a market that is completely at the top of its game. So yes, comic book prices right now are probably at their highest, but we have to think about the long term of this as well. Where will the prices of comic books be about 4.5 years from now when the next recession is over, if it follows the cyclical period that it usually does? Now, this is especially true when we talk about older comic books. Let's say comic books from the 1960s. An old Amazing Spider-Man probably cost you just a few cents to pull it off the rack and is now more than likely a very expensive comic book. Now, in the stock market, there are what's called aristocrat stocks, stocks that will hold their value regardless of what happens, and in the long run, you're going to be okay if you buy into them. Stocks like this include Coca-Cola, among others. Anything that is a mainstay in your household is probably going to be something that sticks around for a really long time at a decent value. Any comic book published before 1970 has a lot of value now just because of the low print runs and just because the characters there were just coming into their prime. Now, to really feel safe investing in that era of comic books, though, you have to ask yourself the question, and you need it answered: why is it a safe investment? Well, the low print runs are a pretty good indicator. Let's talk about the fact that none of these are being printed anymore. They won't ever be printed anymore, and even if they were, they're not going to have the same value as the original comic books from the 1960s and before the 1960s even. Now, you couple that with the notion that these comic book characters are being put on the silver screen, characters that were in their prime in the 1960s, characters that we're pulling stories from still and putting that in movies, you have a recipe for success. Anytime a new comic book movie comes out, if there's a character that hasn't been seen in comic books before, the first appearance of that character, the time in which that character first appeared in comic books, that value of that book goes up immensely. You start to see a little drop-off during the late 1970s in terms of value for first appearances. Comic books were starting to come into their own just as much as the characters that were in them. Now, once you get past the 1980s, you really start having this weird connotation attached to collecting comic books that says this is kind of risky because comic books are now being so mass-produced. Many of the archetypal characters from the 1980s, including Deathstroke and Gambit, the values on those comic books are not exceedingly high if you really think about it, especially when you compare them to comic books from pre-1960s. We're kind of in a bubble in the comic book investing market because everybody's buying into every comic book with the idea that it's going to be worth a lot in a few years. And that's not necessarily the case, especially with these modern books. Anytime a new character is introduced to comic books nowadays, everybody jumps onto the comic book and it's sort of a fad. A good example of this is the introduction of Gwen Stacy as the new Spider-Man, or Spider-Woman. The first appearance of Spider-Gwen is now a $150 book for a pretty high-grade copy, and I may be a little off there, but that's the last thing I remember. I actually have a copy of this book, so I did buy into the fad, but I don't think that this is a comic book that's going to hold its value forever. Comic books nowadays are far too mass-produced for them to hold their value like this. Somebody's going to want to sell these off when they get low on money, especially if we do run into a recession, like I think we will, although that's up for debate, and it's a completely different video topic unrelated to our channel. But I think that if you invest into a comic book now, you have to be really careful if it is not one that is published before 1980s, maybe even 1970s. It's a weird conundrum, I know, because anytime you buy a comic book that was published before 1980, and especially before 1970, you run into the problem of, should I spend this much money on a comic book? Well, you're going to be safe with that investment. If you buy a comic book, then it's going to hold its value, no more are being published, and even through a recession, it's going to get its value again eventually. So if you're buying a comic book from before the 1960s, you have a sound investment. They're not printing any more of those. The print runs were low, and many of the characters published in the 1960s or before are actually in movies nowadays. You go to the 1970s, that's something of a gray zone. You go to the 1980s, you have to start getting a little bit more careful. Past the 2000s, that's when you're going to have your investments that are usually not very safe. At any rate, guys and gals, thank you so much for tuning in to Chosen Totem. I'm your host, Jacob Saylor, and if you enjoyed this content, please hit that subscribe button. We appreciate you being here more than you could possibly imagine, and I am signing off.